waiter tray is the hardest technical flaw to change in all of tennis. It's when a player sets up their hand and their strings facing upwards, like a waiter holding a tray, to push the ball towards the service box to start a point. Hitting a serve that way is the most direct, simple way to put the ball in the box, but it also keeps everyday players severely limited in power and spin. The reason why breaking that specific habit is so hard is because the serve is the most important shot in tennis, and changing from a pushing motion like this one to a pulling motion like this one radically changes the alignment of the racket face and the timing of the swing, which in turn creates totally different outcomes in where the ball goes when you first try to make the switch. That's why it's so rare to see competitive adult tennis players actually change from a waiter tray serve to a proper pull and snap motion like the pros. Let's take a look at a rare case of somebody who actually did it so that you can copy the same drills and achieve dramatically better results on your serve. Here's the player we're going to be studying today. His name is Mark. He's a strong 3-5 player, maybe approaching 4.0. And this is his beginning serve. And a lot of times players just kind of fixate on where the strings are facing, which they are facing upwards. But another critical element technically that you want to pay close attention to when you record yourself to see if you have a waiter tray serve is, does the tip of the racket right here ever point downwards? And does the butt cap of the racket right here ever point upwards? Here's some rapid fire examples of that so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Watch the tip of the racket drop down and the butt cap of the racket is pointing up. This is a pulling position. She is pulling the racket upwards. Here's Sir Andy Murray. Watch the tip of his racket, how it drops down to point downwards, and the butt cap of his racket is pointing upwards. Here's Novak Djokovic. Watch how the tip of his racket drops to point downwards, while the butt cap of his racket is pointed upwards. And here's Roger Federer from the same angle that we're looking at our student from. Watch how the tip of the racket drops down, while the butt cap of his racket is pointed upwards. What this does is it creates a stretch in the shoulder, which then can be released up towards the point of contact. And the edge position of the racket, meaning the frame leading and pointing upwards first, gets to be released and snapped through the point of contact. So now back to our student again quickly so you can see the contrast. Look at how his strings face upwards, but more importantly, the tip of his racket never drops downwards and the butt cap of his racket never points upwards. And so he's left with his hand and his racket facing up towards the point of contact. And so instead of going to a pull position where he can snap the racket, he maintains a push position where he's just pushing the strings forward towards the point of contact. Now here's that same player, Mark, today, and I want you to watch the tip of his racket, how it transitions and drops and stretches his shoulder. And now the tip of his racket is pointing downwards and the butt cap is pointing upwards. And now he's in a pulling position. So he has the ability to release that stretch in his shoulder and actually snap the racket head. So how is Mark able to make this big transition? Let's dive right into it. Step number one is making sure that he has the right grip. The more towards the side of the grip your hand is, aka more of a forehand grip you have, the more open your racket face is going to be as you go up to hit a serve. And this is what Mark used to look like from the back. I want you to notice how as he makes this swing up towards the ball, his strings are leading the way and facing upwards. And here's Novak Djokovic going up towards contact. Look at how the edge of the racket or the frame is leading upwards first, and then he has to unwind and turn the racket to face towards the box to make the ball go there. That release or snap can't happen unless we get the right grip. If you're not sure how to find a continental grip, just do a search on YouTube for Essential Tennis Grip. You'll find out how to get the right grip. That's step number one. Step two is to start to familiarize yourself with 3 key physical positions that are critical to break out of this pushing motion. Position 1 is simply to stand sideways and get your hand and your racket face, or your strings, facing to the right. Now, If you're used to a waiter tray serve, you're used to your hand and your strings facing upwards. Part of this is the grip change. Part of it is also the position of the hand and the wrist. In this first setup position, we want a neutral hand and wrist, like a ruler could go down the back of your hand and the back of your arm, instead of hinging your hand backwards to open the racket face. The second key position is to start to turn the chest forwards, and as that happens, swivel the tip of the racket backwards. Not upwards, but backwards. And watch Mark as he starts to initially practice this. He went right back to an upward facing position because that's what he's used to. In his head, he has this strong connection between hand facing up and serve. And that's what a serve feels like to him. So I would strongly recommend not hitting a ball and frankly, just spending a good chunk of time practicing transitioning from position 1 to position 2 just to get the feeling of keeping your hand neutral, keeping in a continental grip, and making that transition from your hand facing to the right to your hand and your strings facing to the left. That's position 2. Notice how when Mark practices going from position 1 to position 2, the frame stays facing upwards. Now, there are world-class servers that do briefly have the strings facing upwards. That's not always bad or wrong, but in my experience and my recommendation to you would be to initially practice just keeping the frame facing upwards the whole time. Don't let the strings face upwards at all, just to start getting a feel for making that transition without going to a push type of serve. The third and final new position that you got to get yourself familiar with is the unwinding of the hand, the shoulder, the racket face to actually address the ball and correctly face towards the box. On a waiter tray serve, this doesn't exist. So your racket is essentially facing towards the box the whole time, beginning facing upwards, but there isn't any kind of rotation or twisting or snapping of the shoulder or the hand that has to happen. It's facing up and then forwards the whole time. So learning how to unwind the hand and the shoulder is a big part of the process of learning how to serve properly. Notice how when a world-class player makes this transition, the strings don't ever face upwards. The strings go from facing to the left to facing forwards, and they aren't ever facing upwards. So in a nutshell, what I'm guiding Mark through is experiencing a position 1 where his strings are facing to the right. Then, after starting to turn his body and dropping the tip of the racket, we want the strings to face to the left. And then right before contact gets made, he's going to unwind and turn the racket face so that his strings face forwards. This is so different that imagine if I just tossed him a ball and said, okay, Mark, here you go, like hit a serve, let's play tennis. Would the ball go in the box? Of course not. And this is why making this change to go from a push serve to a pull serve happens so rarely. So this takes time. You have to be very patient. If you currently have a push type of serve, you have to take this as like a journey. This is a long-term goal. This is a long-term project that we're taking on, and it takes a lot of commitment and a lot of work over a period of time to really make this transition. Step 3 is now putting those positions together with a little bit of smoothness and a little bit of continuousness so that he's not actually stopping and having to like check in and make sure he's doing all the positions correctly. He's actually starting to move through them continuously and smoothly. In step 4, I had him add the left arm motion, aka the toss, but that's also like a big part of preparing the body, coiling the body, and tilting the body up into a good position. But he hadn't been thinking about adding that at all up until this point. So step number 4 is just simply holding a ball, not even tossing it, but starting to mimic, okay, how are we going to put all this together with the 3 different positions with the hand and the racket and coordinate that with the left side of the body as well? And guess what? When he started attempting that, he went right back to facing his hand upwards. But with a little bit of reinforcement and reminders, he started to get it and put it all together. In step 5 of our training, I had him start to do a fake toss. That means he's not actually hitting the ball, he's just doing a tossing motion, but I've instructed him to toss the ball off to the side where he couldn't actually hit it even if he wanted to, just to practice combining the releasing of the ball with the correct positions 1, 2, and 3 and the correct grip that we've been talking about. He's starting to coordinate a lot together now. And on some of them, he's actually checking all the boxes, which is fantastic. And when you practice this, make sure you don't go to the next step until you're actually doing it right. And I know this seems kind of silly to add all these little, small changes and small increases in challenge, but this is what it takes to actually keep consciously doing the right thing correctly without adding too much challenge where he's just going to go back to doing the waiter tray serve. Step 6 is now to actually start consciously syncing together the toss location and the serve motion. So we're still doing fake tosses, but now I want him to line up the timing of how he's moving his racket with the timing of when the toss is coming down into where he would be making contact, still not hitting it. And when I see that he's actually doing it well, he's coordinating it correctly, and he's maintaining that edge position, and he's doing all the 3 positions correctly, I start getting really excited, and now it's time to actually try it out. So that brings us to step 7. I have him do a shadow swing, meaning no toss, no hit, just to physically remind himself these are the positions that I want to hit, and then actually do a real toss and a real hit. And to be totally honest with you, I'm just going to be totally transparent. Most of the time when I work on moving players away from a waiter tray position, even after maybe 45 minutes of work or an hour of work, just getting to this point, when I say, okay, let's try to hit a ball, and remember, just do it the way we've been practicing, most of the time they go back to some variation of the waiter tray when they actually hit the ball. Mark, on like his second or third try, actually did it. He held the edge, he hit all the positions, he went through all of the different checkpoints that we've been talking about, and look at where the ball went. And so when players first try this, the ball usually goes nowhere near the box. And that's what happened for Mark, which actually made me really excited because it means that he actually held that edge position a little too long. And now it's a process of learning how long to hold it and when to actually release the racket to get the strings facing towards the box. So Mark went back home to England and he kept practicing, and several months later, he sent me this practice video where he's continuing making the right progressions in the right positions where his strings right now are facing to his right, then the tip of the racket is dropping, and now his strings are facing to the left, and he's holding that edge position, and then turning his racket to face forwards at contact, and then release and come across his body. Beautiful, fantastic, but this is, again, after months of work, and that's what it takes to make this change. And now here's Mark today. This is 10 months later after working together. He's back on the baseline, actually hitting a real serve now, and the tip of his racket is pointing up. His strings are facing right, and he's transitioning to the tip of the racket dropping, his strings facing left. He's stretching the shoulder. The butt cap is pointing upwards. Tip of the racket is pointing downwards. And now he's starting to release and turn the racket correctly and make a full real service motion. If you've been struggling with the waiter tray on your serve, you can make the change, but it takes a lot of very deliberate practice. My honest recommendation is you should expect months of work to actually make this change. And that might mean that during those months of training, that you don't play any matches. Because if you do play matches, you're going to go back to the way you know how to get it in the box, and that just short circuits the training and short circuits the process and the change that you're trying to make. But once you do make the change, it opens the door to tremendously more racket head speed, tremendously more power, tremendously more spin, and different types of spin. It's a total game changer on the serve. So please stick with it, use these steps, stay the course. I know you can make the change too and dramatically improve your game.